He should have died out there, but she refused to let him. The sun sat high and merciless, baking the desert past 100 degrees, turning every breath into dry fire in Ethan Cole's lungs as he lay half-buried in dust, his hat long gone, his canteen empty, and the world shrinking down to heat, silence, and regret. 3 hours earlier, he had been riding hard through a narrow canyon, chasing shadows he didn't fully understand, acting on instinct the way men like him always did out here. And now the consequence of that instinct pressed against his ribs with every shallow breath, a mistake he could not take back, a moment he could not explain, and out on this endless stretch of land, explanations didn't matter anyway, only what was seen and what was remembered. The wind dragged grains of sand across his skin like whispers, and somewhere between waking and fading, Ethan heard hoofbeats, slow at first, deliberate, not the frantic rhythm of pursuit, but something steadier, something certain, and when the shadow finally crossed his face, it blocked out the sun just enough for him to open his eyes. She sat tall on a dark horse, unmoving, watching him the way someone watches a decision already made, her presence quiet but absolute, her hair braided with small pieces of bone and turquoise that caught the light without asking for it. And in her gaze there was no fear, no hesitation, only recognition. Ethan tried to move, tried to reach for something, anything, but his body answered with nothing but a weak shift of dust beneath him. And that was when she spoke, her voice low, steady, untouched by the heat that crushed everything else. "Get on my horse, handsome cowboy, or you die here." And there was no softness in it, no kindness, just a simple truth laid bare between them. For a moment, he thought he was imagining her, some final mirage shaped like consequence. But the smell of leather, the creak of the saddle, the slow exhale of the horse beneath her, all of it was real, grounded, undeniable, and still, she didn't move. To help him, not yet, as if waiting for something, for him to choose, for him to understand what this moment cost. Ethan's eyes drifted upward, catching the faint glint at her throat, a small pendant resting against her chest, turquoise wrapped in worn silver. Simple, but carrying weight he couldn't name yet, and something in his chest tightened, not from pain, but from the creeping sense that this encounter had started long before he ever saw her. The desert stretched around them in all directions, empty to anyone else, but not to her, because she knew this land, and she knew what it remembered. And as the wind picked up again, carrying the faint echo of distant riders somewhere beyond the ridge, she finally shifted in her saddle, just enough to reach down, not to pull him up, but to offer the chance, and nothing more. The desert did not wait for decisions. It simply swallowed the ones who hesitated, and Ethan Cole knew that as his fingers twitched against the sand, reaching not for pride, not for a weapon, but for the only thing still offered to him, a chance. The horse shifted under Niyelli, its breath slow and steady, as if it had seen this moment before, as if it understood something Ethan did not, and she remained still above him, her hand extended just enough to bridge the distance without closing it, leaving the choice entirely his. The heat pressed down harder now, blurring the edges of the world, and somewhere in that haze, Ethan saw flashes of what had led him here, the canyon walls, the echo of hooves, a figure moving too fast, too distant to read clearly, and the split second where instinct had spoken louder than thought, a mistake measured not in seconds, but in consequences. His throat burned as he forced a breath, then another, and with a final effort that felt heavier than any weight he had carried before, he pushed himself upward, his hand brushing against hers, rough against rough, not gentle, not forgiving, just enough to pull him into motion. The climb onto the horse was clumsy, slow, his strength failing halfway through, but she did not rush to help him. She did not soften the moment. She simply adjusted her balance, allowing him space to complete what he had started. And when he finally settled behind her, barely able to sit upright, the world seemed to tilt. For a second before, steadying again, she clicked her tongue once, quiet, controlled, and the horse began to move, turning away from where he had fallen as if that place no longer mattered, as if it had already claimed what it could. For a long stretch of time, neither of them spoke, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth, the wind slipping past them in thin, restless currents, carrying dust and something else, something distant, something that made the back of Ethan's neck tighten despite his fading strength. His vision drifted, focusing and unfocusing, catching fragments of her silhouette, the straight line of her back, the way she held the reins without tension, as if control was something she did not need to prove. And again, his eyes found the pendant at her throat, that small piece of turquoise catching the sunlight with quiet insistence. There was something about it, something familiar in a way that did not make sense yet, something that pulled at the edges of his memory, without revealing itself fully. And the more he looked, the heavier that feeling became, settling deep in his chest where guilt and confusion began to take shape. He swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a dry whisper when it finally came, asking nothing clearly, forming no full question, just a fragment of sound that hung between them and faded into the wind. She did not turn, did not acknowledge it, but her shoulders shifted slightly, a small, almost imperceptible reaction that suggested she had heard, and perhaps understood more than she chose to show. The land around them began to change slowly, the flat stretch of open desert giving way to scattered rock formations, low ridges that cast longer shadows as the sun edged west. And with that change came something else, a feeling that they were no longer alone out here, that the emptiness was only surface deep. Ethan's grip on the saddle tightened without thinking, his instincts returning in fragments, warning him of presence, of watchers just beyond sight. And though he could not see them yet, he felt it in the way the horse's ears flicked back, in the subtle way Niyelli adjusted their path, not avoiding, not confronting, simply moving as if she already knew where they would be. Then, for a brief moment, as they crested a low rise, Ethan caught it, silhouettes on the far ridge, still as stone, watching, waiting, and he realized with a clarity that cut through the haze that whatever choice she had made in saving him was not finished yet, it was only beginning. The figures on the ridge did not move, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most. Not their number, not their silence, but the way they watched without urgency, as if time belonged to them, and not to the man barely holding himself upright on the back of a borrowed chance. The sun dipped lower now, stretching shadows across the land in long, uneven lines, and with every step the horse took, the distance between them and that ridge did not feel like escape. It felt like a path already chosen. Ethan shifted slightly behind Niyelli, his strength returning in fragments, just enough to make him aware of the weight of his own body again, of the dry pull in his chest, of the thoughts he had tried to outrun catching up one by one. His gaze drifted once more to the pendant at her throat, and this time the memory did not stay hidden. It surfaced slowly, like something long buried refusing to remain silent. The same color, the same silver wrapping, the same small imperfection near the edge, where the metal bent slightly out of shape, a detail he had noticed hours earlier without knowing why it mattered. His breath caught, not from pain, but from understanding beginning to form, incomplete but undeniable, and with it came a quiet dread that settled deeper than the desert heat ever could. The horse slowed as they approached a narrow passage between two low rock formations, the kind of place where sound carried differently, where even the wind seemed to hesitate before passing through, and Niyelli guided them in without looking back, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made Ethan realize she had known about the watchers long before he ever saw them. The air grew cooler by a few degrees, just enough to feel like relief, just enough to sharpen the edges of reality again, and for a moment, Ethan allowed himself to think they might pass through unnoticed, that whatever waited on that ridge might choose not to follow. Then he heard it, not loud, not sudden, just the faint shift of movement behind them, a horse stepping where it had not stepped before, another presence closing the distance without rushing it, and the illusion of being alone disappeared completely. Ethan straightened as much as he could, his hand instinctively tightening against the saddle, not reaching for anything, just grounding himself in something real. And his voice came again, clearer this time, though still rough from thirst and exhaustion. "You knew," he said, the words simple, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what had become obvious. Niyelli did not answer right away, and in that silence, the weight of everything between them grew heavier, until finally she spoke, her voice low, carried by the wind just enough for him to hear. "This land does not hide anything. And there was something in the way she said it that told him she was not only speaking about the riders behind them. They emerged from the passage into a wider stretch of open ground, but it was different from before, not empty, not untouched, but watched in a way that felt deliberate. And as the horse slowed to a near stop, Ethan saw them again, closer now, shapes resolving into people, into faces, into eyes that did not look at him with confusion, but with recognition. The realization settled fully then, heavy and quiet, that this was not a chance encounter, not a simple rescue. And as Niyelli finally turned her head just enough for him to see her profile, he understood one more thing. She had not brought him away from them. She had brought him to them. No one reached for a weapon, and somehow that made everything heavier. The riders ahead formed a loose line across the open ground, not blocking the path, not rushing forward, just waiting, their horses still, their eyes steady. And in that quiet, Ethan understood something he had not felt before: judgment without noise, without chaos, just presence. Niyelli brought the horse to a full stop, the leather creaking softly as the animal settled. And for a long moment, she did not move, did not speak, did not even look back at him, as if allowing the weight of what was coming to land fully on his shoulders before anything else could happen. The air shifted, cooler now with the sun dropping behind the distant ridge, casting a muted gold across the scene. And in that light, the faces ahead became clearer, older men with weathered lines carved deep into their skin, younger ones with sharp eyes that carried both patience and restraint. And none of them looked surprised to see Ethan there. His throat tightened as he glanced again at the pendant resting against Niyelli's chest, the turquoise catching the last of the sunlight. And now there was no doubt left, no room for confusion. The memory had fully formed. The canyon, the sudden movement, the glint of that same stone in the distance, and the moment where everything had shifted before he could understand it. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to accept, because out here, truth did not need to be spoken loudly to be real. When he opened them again, Niyelli finally moved, sliding down from the horse with a controlled, effortless motion, her boots touching the ground without a sound. And for the first time since she found him, she turned fully to face him, her expression unchanged, calm, unreadable. But her eyes held something deeper now, something that carried more than just the present moment. Ethan tried to steady himself as he shifted his weight, the ground feeling unfamiliar beneath his boots, as if it belonged to a different world than the one he had been living in just hours before. And when he looked at her, really looked this time, he saw not anger, not hatred, but something far more difficult to face, a kind of quiet knowing that did not need to accuse him to make him understand. The riders ahead began to move then, not charging, not surrounding, just closing the distance in a slow, deliberate way that felt more like a gathering than a confrontation, and the sound of hooves against the earth echoed softly around them, filling the silence without breaking it. Ethan's instincts told him to prepare, to brace for something, but there was no clear threat, no raised voices, no sudden movements, only the steady approach of people who already knew what they were looking at. Niyelli stepped forward slightly, placing herself between Ethan and the approaching riders, not in a defensive stance, not as a barrier, but as a presence that carried weight. And when the first of the riders stopped just a few yards away, the space between them felt charged with everything unsaid. One of the older men studied Ethan for a long moment, his gaze steady, not hostile, not forgiving, just certain, and Ethan felt that gaze settle on him like a truth he could not step away from. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dust and sage, and in that quiet, Niyelli's voice broke the stillness, low, even, and final, not explaining, not justifying, only stating what she had chosen. He stands here because I brought him. And as the words settled into the space between them, Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be decided by fear, but by something far more difficult to face. The weight of a choice made without hatred. The words did not echo. They settled, heavy and still, as if the land itself had heard them before and was waiting to see what would follow. No one spoke immediately, and in that silence, Ethan felt the full weight of where he stood, not as a stranger who had wandered into danger, but as a man who had been brought here on purpose, placed in front of people who already knew more about him than he could explain. The older man stepped forward slightly, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore, his presence calm, deliberate, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried no anger, only certainty. "You crossed our land," he said, each word measured, "and something followed you here." And though the sentence was simple, it held more meaning than it revealed. Ethan swallowed, his throat still dry, his mind searching for something to say, something that could stand in this place and not fall apart. But words felt small now, thinner than the truth that had already formed between them. His gaze drifted again to the pendant at Niyelli's throat, and without thinking, he spoke, his voice low but steady enough to carry, "That stone. I saw it before." And the moment the words left him, he knew there was no taking them back, no softening what they meant. The riders did not react outwardly, but something shifted in the air, subtle, like a breath held just a little longer than before, and Niyelli's eyes found his. Not sharp, not accusing, just waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to continue, not out of defense, not out of fear, but because silence now would be its own kind of answer. "In the canyon," he said, "there was someone. I did not understand what I was seeing." And the admission hung there, incomplete but honest in a way that did not try to excuse itself. The older man studied him, long enough that the space between them seemed to stretch, and when he spoke again, his tone did not change. "Understanding comes after the moment, not before," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a statement of how the world worked. Ethan nodded faintly, the truth of that settling deeper than anything else, and for the first time since this began, he did not try to defend himself, did not reach for reasons or explanations. He simply stood there, carrying what had already happened. Niyelli shifted her stance slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough to remind everyone that she was still there, still part of this moment. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter now, but no less firm. "He could have been left where he fell," she said, not looking at Ethan, but at the man before her. "The desert would have taken him without question." And she let the words settle before continuing. "But I chose differently." And in that choice, there was no request for approval, no need for agreement, only a fact. The riders remained still, but their attention shifted, not away from Ethan, but toward her, weighing her words in a way that carried history, trust, and something deeper than either of them could see fully. The wind moved through the space again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of distant birds settling for the evening. And in that quiet, Ethan realized something he had not expected. This was not about what he had done alone. It was about what she had chosen to do after. And that choice had brought him here, not to face anger, not to face punishment, but to stand inside something far more difficult, the chance to be seen clearly, without the noise of fear or the comfort of misunderstanding. The older man finally nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be spoken aloud, and the tension that had been holding the moment together did not break. It shifted, becoming something quieter, something steadier, something that had not decided its end yet. The nod from the older man did not end anything. It only opened a different kind of silence, one that no longer pressed down with tension, but stretched outward like a question no one was rushing to answer. The riders eased slightly in their saddles, not relaxing, not lowering their awareness, but shifting into something that felt less like a standoff and more like a circle forming around a truth that had already been placed in the center. Ethan stood where he was, the weight in his chest no longer sharp, but steady, like something he would carry long after this moment passed. And for the first time since the desert had nearly taken him, he did not feel like running, not from them, not from himself. Niyelli moved again, but not away. She stepped closer to him instead, just enough to stand beside him rather than between him and the others. And that small change carried more meaning than any words she could have spoken. It was not protection in the way he had known it. It was presence, shared and unhidden. The older man glanced at her briefly, then back to Ethan, his expression unchanged, yet there was something in his eyes that softened just enough to be noticed. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition of the path that had led here. "You saw something," he said, not asking, simply continuing the thread Ethan had already begun. And the way he said it made it clear that what mattered now was not the past itself, but how it was carried forward. Ethan nodded slowly. The memory sharper now, no longer blurred by heat or distance. The canyon walls rising on either side. The narrow stretch where shadows moved differently. And that single moment where instinct had filled the space before understanding could arrive. I saw movement, he said quietly. And I chose too quickly. And there was no defense in his voice, no attempt to make it lighter than it was. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint rustle through the low brush, and somewhere behind the riders, a horse stamped once against the ground, the sound small but grounding, reminding Ethan that this was not a dream, not a story he could wake from, but a moment that would remain exactly as it was. Niyelli's hand lifted slightly, not toward him, not toward the others, but toward the pendant at her throat, her fingers brushing it once, lightly, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be explained aloud. And when she spoke, her voice was steady. "He sees it now," she said, and there was no accusation in the words, only a quiet statement of change. The older man watched her for a moment longer, then shifted his gaze back to Ethan, measuring something that did not show on the surface, and finally, he stepped aside, not fully, just enough to open a narrow path through the line of riders. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, but it changed everything, not because it offered escape, but because it offered something far more difficult, the choice to move forward without being forced. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from fear, but from the realization that this path was not about leaving. It was about stepping deeper into what had already begun. And when he took that first step, slow and unsteady, the ground beneath him felt the same as before, but he did not. Niyelli did not follow immediately. She remained where she was, watching him move, her expression unchanged, her presence still anchored in the moment they had just shared. And as Ethan passed through the space opened for him, he felt the eyes of the riders shift, not tracking him as a threat, not judging him as an outsider, but acknowledging him as someone who had crossed into something he did not yet fully understand. The sun dipped lower behind the ridge, casting longer shadows that stretched across the land like quiet markers of time, and in that fading light, Ethan realized that whatever waited beyond this line was not an ending. It was a continuation, shaped not by what had happened in the canyon, but by what he chose to carry from it now. The path did not lead away from them. It led through them, and Ethan felt it with every step, the quiet shift of eyes, the subtle turning of heads, not following him, not guarding him, but acknowledging his presence as something that had already been decided. The ground beneath his boots was firmer here, packed by years of movement, by lives lived in rhythm with the land rather than against it, and the deeper he walked, the more he realized this place was not hidden, it was simply unseen by those who never learned how to look. The air carried different scents now, sage, smoke, leather worn by time rather than use, and somewhere beyond the low ridge ahead, he could hear the faint sound of voices, not loud, not urgent, just steady, like a life continuing without pause. He slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but because something inside him needed to match the pace of where he was, needed to shed the urgency that had driven him into the canyon hours before. Behind him, the riders remained where they were, not closing in, not leaving, simply holding the line they had formed. And when Ethan glanced back briefly, he saw Niyelli still standing where he had left her, her figure framed by the fading light, unmoving, watching, not as someone guarding him, but as someone witnessing what he would do next. The path curved gently between two larger rock formations, and as he stepped through, the space opened into something wider, a quiet settlement shaped by intention rather than chance. Low structures built close to the earth, fires burning low and controlled, figures moving through the space with a calm that did not break when he appeared. No one rushed toward him, no one turned away. They simply noticed, and in that noticing, there was no fear, no hostility, just awareness, as if his presence had already been understood before he arrived. Ethan stopped near the edge of that space, unsure for the first time not of danger, but of place, of where he fit in a moment that did not belong to him, and as he stood there, the weight of the pendant returned to his mind, not as an object, but as a connection he had not chosen, yet could not ignore. A young boy passed nearby, carrying a small bundle of wood, his steps light, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's without hesitation, without judgment, and then moving on, as if Ethan was simply another part of the scene that needed no explanation. The simplicity of that moment struck harder than anything else, because it carried no history, no memory of the canyon, no understanding of what had happened, only presence, immediate and unburdened. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to let something else take its place. Not comfort, not relief, but clarity, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to hide behind. He heard footsteps behind him then, light, measured, and he did not need to turn to know who it was. The rhythm already familiar in a way he had not expected. Niyelli came to stand beside him again, not close, not distant, just enough to share the same view. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer sharp, no longer uncertain, but settled, like something that had found its place without needing to be named. Ethan's eyes moved once more to the pendant at her throat, and this time, when he spoke, his voice carried something different, not confusion, not defense, but acceptance. It belonged to him. He said quietly, not asking, not doubting, just stating what had finally become clear. Niyelli did not look at him when she answered, her gaze fixed ahead, her voice steady. "It still does," she said, and in those few words, Ethan understood that nothing about this moment was about taking, or keeping, or losing. It was about what remained, and what would be carried forward from it. The fire burned low, steady, its light folding into the deepening dusk, and Ethan stood there longer than he realized, watching the quiet movement of people who did not pause for him, who did not shape their world around his presence. And somehow that steadiness pressed against him harder than any judgment could have. Niyelli remained beside him, not guiding, not explaining. Simply there. And in that silence, he began to understand that whatever this place was, it did not ask for words first. It asked for something else, something carried in how a man stood, how he stayed. A woman passed in front of them, older, her steps slow but certain, a woven cloth folded over her arm. And as she drew near, her gaze lifted to Ethan, not sharp, not distant, just present, and she nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, before continuing on her way, and that single gesture held more weight than any question he had prepared himself to answer. Ethan's shoulders shifted slightly, not in defense, but in recognition of what was being given to him without demand, a space to remain, to be seen without being forced into anything beyond that. The sky above them deepened into a soft blue, the first hints of night settling in, and with it came a cooler air that carried the scent of wood smoke and something else, something older, something that felt rooted in time rather than passing through it. He turned his head slightly toward Niyelli, not fully, just enough to speak without breaking the quiet between them. "Why bring me here?" he asked, his voice low, not challenging, not searching for justification, just needing to understand the shape of the path he had been placed on. She did not answer immediately, her gaze still forward, following the slow rhythm of the settlement, as if her response needed to align with something beyond the moment. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, calm. "Because leaving you in the sand would have been easy," she said, and there was no pride in it, no weight of sacrifice, just a simple truth. Ethan let that settle, the words finding their place in him without resistance. And after a moment, he spoke again, quieter now. "And this is not easy." And it was not a question, just an acknowledgement of what stood between them. Niyelli's eyes shifted then, not to him, but to the pendant at her throat, her fingers brushing it. Once more, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed if Ethan had not been watching for it. And when she spoke again, there was something deeper in her tone, something that carried memory without naming it. "Easy does not change anything," she said. The words lingered, not sharp, not heavy, but firm, and Ethan felt them settle into the same place where his earlier realization had begun to take shape, connecting what he had done with what she had chosen after, not erasing it, not softening it, but placing it into something larger than either of them alone. A faint sound rose from the far side of the settlement, a voice calling softly, not urgent, just part of the evening rhythm, and Niyelli stepped forward slightly, her posture shifting as if responding to that call. But she did not leave. Not yet. Ethan looked out across the space again, seeing it differently now, not as something he had been brought into, but as something he had stepped into by continuing forward when the path opened. And for the first time since the canyon, he did not feel like he was being carried by the moment. He felt like he was standing inside it. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and though nothing had been resolved, nothing declared, he understood something that had not been clear before. This was not about being forgiven, not about being judged. It was about being present long enough to see what that meant. And as the firelight flickered against the growing dark, he realized that whatever came next would not be decided in words, but in what he chose to do when no one was asking anything of him. The night settled fully, quiet and complete, wrapping the land in a calm that did not ask for anything in return, and Ethan remained near the edge of the firelight longer than anyone expected him to, longer than he expected himself to, watching the slow rhythm of a place that did not bend for him, did not react to him. And in that stillness, something inside him began to shift into alignment with it. No one came to question him. No one asked him to explain, and the absence of demand became its own kind of mirror, forcing him to face what he carried without distraction, without noise. A man approached from the far side of the fire, older, steady, holding a small leather pouch in his hand, and when he reached Ethan, he did not speak at first. He simply extended the pouch forward, offering it without instruction. Ethan hesitated only a moment before taking it, the leather worn smooth by time, the weight inside light but deliberate, and when he opened it, he found a small piece of cloth, folded carefully, simple, unmarked, yet held with a care that made it more than it appeared. He looked up, confusion not sharp, just quiet, and the older man met his gaze with the same calm that had been there from the beginning. "You carry what you understand," he said, not explaining further, not adding more. And then he stepped back, leaving Ethan with the object and the meaning he would have to find for it himself. The fire cracked softly behind him, a brief sound that faded quickly into the night, and Ethan stood there with the cloth in his hand, the weight of it settling not in his palm, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been shifting since the canyon. Since the moment everything had changed, he closed the pouch slowly, carefully, as if the act itself required intention, and when he lifted his eyes again, he found Niyelli across the fire, her figure outlined by the low light, her expression unchanged, but her presence no longer distant, no longer separate, just part of the same space he now stood in. She did not move toward him, did not call him, and he understood then that whatever had begun between them did not need to be spoken into something else. It already existed in the choices that had been made, in the path that had been walked. The night deepened further, the sky stretching wide and clear above them, filled with stars that did not rush, did not fade, just remained, and Ethan felt something settle inside him, not resolution, not peace, but direction, quiet and steady. He took a slow breath, then another, and without looking back, he stepped away from the fire, moving toward the edge of the settlement, toward the same path that had brought him here, his steps no longer uncertain, no longer driven by instinct alone, but by something that had taken shape in silence. When he reached the boundary where shadow met open land, he paused for a brief moment, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge what he was leaving and what he was carrying with him. And though he did not turn, he knew she was still there, watching, not holding him back, not pushing him forward, simply witnessing the choice. The wind moved gently across the ground, lifting dust in soft currents that caught the faint light. And as Ethan stepped out into the open once more, the desert did not feel the same as it had before. It no longer felt like something that would take him. It felt like something that would remember him. Behind him, the fire burned low, steady as it had always been, and somewhere within that quiet, unspoken space, the line between what had happened and what would follow remained, not erased, not forgotten, but carried forward in a way that did not need words to be